Okay guys, welcome. So I want to show you how to do your UV unwrapping on a character model. Obviously we haven't done much UV unwrapping since last semester, so this should carry over to any other objects that you want to unwrap. The key, right, for unwrapping is to simplify your models just in your brain down to potentially one of the existing UV unwrapping options. That's going to make your life much easier, right? If you can think about things in terms of are they close to a cylinder shape like an arm or a leg or a head, right? Or are they close to a spherical shape like the face is often done with a spherical unwrap? Or are they kind of like flat already and you can just get away with using a planar unwrap? So we have all of these options inside the UV menu here, and I wanted to walk you guys through this process on a very simple model like this, which is 202 faces. Oh, I should get rid of those last two. Right, which is a very low poly model. This would probably be something which would suffice if, say, your camera angle is nice and high up. Totally fine to get away with using a model of this complexity, right? Especially if you're doing something like a MOBA or something, right, where you anticipate having a lot of characters on screen. The simpler the better, because you're going to be pushing more and more polys every time that you add another character. From there, right, we can also look at kind of a character that's been smoothed out a little bit, almost double the amount of polys. Because they've got lots of cuts here and the places where they would need it to deform the model, right? The important places would be the cuts on the shoulders here, and just making sure that you have at least two edges in any place that is going to bend or turn. That will help the animation or help the rig to deform the model in a way that won't pinch the model, where, say, if you only have a single cut, oftentimes what will happen is one side will look okay, but the other side will collapse in on itself, and you'll get this very thin point in your model where things are trying to bend but don't have the geometry, right? It's similar in a sense to when you hit mesh smooth, right? When you smooth out a mesh, and maybe if you don't have a lot of cuts in certain places, right, it will deform those areas more. Whereas if you reinforce the model with some cross cuts, it will deform that area a little bit less, right? And our goal, right, and what makes rigging and animation hard is having the human anatomy knowledge or creature anatomy knowledge, right, that is going to come through your 3D models. You can get into ZBrush and create a super high poly model that looks perfect from every angle, right? Looks just like something. But getting a model that can also animate is a whole nother set of skills and a whole nother challenge, right? So for instance, one model that I saw last week was a 3D scan of a human being, and it looks amazing because it is pixel by pixel capturing the texture, right, from lots of different camera angles. How these 3D scanners move is generally a camera with a height sensor laser, right, will be moved around a model or have the model spin in place. Sometimes you can find these kinds of demos, like I saw one at Comic-Con one time where I went and you could get into this little booth with your cosplay, right, strike a pose, and it will scan you into 3D in a matter of minutes. The issue with that, right, is the algorithm that it uses to then create the vertices along the character does not deform well when it comes to actually animating things like a face or an arm or something. So the goal for us as game modelers, right, as 3D modelers for games or any kind of animation, is to really be able to bring the anatomy through the model, right, and make sure that that stays intact as we animate. So as we move to higher poly models, right, it's not just a matter of like throwing more geometry out there, right? We could just like subdivide it. Oh, geez, it's always stressful hitting that button, right? And things do get smoother, but you get these little areas where maybe the smoothness does not correspond to what you would expect to see on an actual human being. And in other places, it might smooth things out. Say like this chin has gotten a bit shorter, right? It might smooth things out that you would not want necessarily to be smooth. And I've got little stray vertices and some cuts here that I didn't notice before. Oh, those are my belt cuts. Put you back in your place, little guy. Go back to your home. All right, so this is a model which is now almost 1,600 faces, right? About 4 times as many polygons on this guy as on this low poly version. So again, what you need to think about with your own models is how far away is the camera and what camera angle are you using, right? Obviously, in a first-person model, you might not have to model the character at all. However, oftentimes, you know, your hands are going to be on screen, and you're going to have a gun or something, right, that you're carrying around in your hands. Those models will need to be higher detail and higher polygon, right? Like in something like Call of Duty game, your rifle might be as many polys as a character model, right? It's that high of poly count. And the reason for that is just because it is going to be so much closer to the camera. Any detail that's missing will be noticed by the player. So to demonstrate that, or to give you an idea of what's happening, right, to think about these things, if you're interested in that technology, right, is that the 3D mesh itself needs to be displayed on a monitor, right? And so those pixels, right, are not necessarily going to correspond to seeing every single detail on the 3D mesh, right? It has to be understood in a format that the monitor can display. So our monitors use pixels, right? We have a certain resolution that we're trying to hit, generally 1920 by 1080, which is our 1080p. Of course, new game engines will be aiming for 4K display, which makes our lives harder as artists. But some of the things that we need to think about, right, are whether or not a certain area of the model is going to be displayed on screen, how big, how many sort of, we don't necessarily think about it in terms of the pixel height or things like that. We don't. We use kind of softer measuring methods, right? Like just does it look all right to the eye? But we do need to think about like, hey, I'm never going to see the character's face up close. I don't really need that much detail there, right? So thinking about these things ahead of time will make your life a bit easier. So I think what I'll do is I will demonstrate on this kind of mid detail character, this low-res character. We looked at in the modeling video how to get to a very simple unwrap. So let me just demonstrate that again, right? So I have the UV editor open. In general, when you have finished modeling, right, you want to do a couple things. You want to go to your history and delete all by type history. I want to be in object mode for that though. And then I will also do a modify freeze transformations, which in case I have sort of scaled the character at all, right? We don't want our scale or things to be less than 1 or different to 1. So by hitting freeze transformations, everything gets set back to 1. That's going to be important for importing into game engines and things, because that can kind of mess things up if everything's at a different scale in Maya, and it's not set to 1, right? It might rescale when you get into your game engine. Next, we often just want to name our character, right? Like, or name our object. So I'll just call it main character here. Did I put a space there? Alright, so once I have the character deleted history, right, and I've frozen the transformations, your first move is generally going to go to UV automatic and just see what pops out here. Maya has its own algorithm, right, to try and see which faces all share the same plane, right? So someone like me with a big forehead, right, we might have a flat area on our head. Maya will detect that as a flat area and will try to be like, okay, that should be from the front view. The side of the head should be from a side view. And so it's important to realize, all of this stuff is just taking a curved surface and we're just flattening it out, right, so that you can draw on it, basically. Now, once we look at Substance Painter, right, we'll see that Substance Painter is clever enough to let us draw directly, around curves and things, and it will automatically map, a flat shape into that curved shape, which makes our lives quite a bit easier. But if we're going to look at sort of mobile games and things, right, sometimes you don't need to include Substance Painter in your pipeline just because it is going to, it might be overkill, right? You might never see those details on the texture, or you might not be able to afford the program, right, if you're in a small studio and you have to pay for a professional license. Luckily, it does have a free license now. Alright, so once I have started, right, I'm going to look for the simplest shape on my model that I'm not too intimidated by. That can include, my QB hands over here. We don't want to dive directly into something complicated, right, where, we want to kind of take it slow with a warm-up. Typically, when I'm working in the to start with, right, I'm going to be using face mode and selecting things with the marquee, or to swap to kind of a lasso tool, which lets me grab some extra pieces. Some shortcuts that are handy. My favorite one is probably the grow and shrink selection at this stage, right? So if I select just a middle section of the character here, right up their arms, let's look at, just to remind ourselves some of the selection tools. Let me bring up Karnak. Okay, hopefully this will help so you guys can see what I'm hitting. So when I have a selection like this, remember a large part of being a 3D modeler is just having a lot of tricks for doing things in fewer clicks, right? The fewer clicks we can spend to do something, the less time it's going to take us. So first one that I like to use is the grow and shrink selection tools. On my keyboard I'm holding shift and I'm pressing period and comma, which give me the greater than and less than symbols. That is what I'm using to grow or shrink a selection. Right? Another handy quick selection tool is holding down tab. Lets me paint on my selection. Right? Or if I hover over a place that's already selected, I can deselect it also with tab. Yeah? Alright, so if I've selected an area that I want to unwrap, say this arm, the next thing I need to think about is my seams. So the problem with seams is that it shows where a texture breaks from one sort of pattern to another. So the easiest way to think about this is clothing, right? Actual clothing in the real world is sewn together, and typically it involves several different pieces that go together. So we've seen this in the real world, so we kind of accept it in the game world, right? Where, say, I have my jumper here. It actually is sewn together in places, right, where the fabric changes direction, and oftentimes, right, the sleeves are going to be cut from a separate piece of cloth, right? So getting these patterns to line up, right, these lines to line up, involves some artistry, right? It involves some forethought, but it's not uncommon, right, to see a break here where suddenly the pattern does not line up perfectly, right? So what that means for us as artists, right, is in the game world, we can also use those areas as seams, right, where our texture might not flow perfectly through that area, but it's not as big of a deal because it does reflect how the clothing would be put together in the real world, right? So for something like an arm, we want to take that into account, right? That this area here, this break, is all right to put a seam there. Now, we have a couple ways to move forward on here if we're going to create this arm, right, as our first unwrapped object. My favorite thing to do is to use the cylindrical unwrap, which creates a bit of a mess in the UV editor and will give you something like this in the viewport, right? So here it's trying to say like, okay, let's put a ring around this arm and then map those vertices out onto a flat space. So this looks like garbage because the cylinder is not lined up with the arm. To fix this, we can click on this tiny little red T here. Right, so this manipulator here can be changed if we click on the T, and which brings up a new selection tool. I'm going to get to the front view here. I could also hit space to swap my viewport and go directly to the front. That way I know that I'm rotating on an exact 90-degree angle. Then I'm going to grab this outer ring and I'm just going to rotate the cylinder, right, so that it is aligned with my arm, right? So obviously this shape for the cylinder lines up with the arm much more closely. I could also stretch it out if I want. The last thing to look at is here in the UV editor, right, this shape that's coming out. Often you'll have a small break here where it's a straight line, straight line, straight line, and then you'll get like a cut out of here, and that cut will appear somewhere else. To fix that, what I do is I now go to a 90-degree view and I rotate again, and as I rotate, it will look for a new edge to snap onto. Now in my case it looks like I'm getting some weirdness when I try to do that, so I'll probably have to fix that little piece manually. However, this is handy as well because you can also see this cut along the back of the arm, right? We want to try to hide our cuts in a place where the player is not going to see, much like the seam, right, where if we do have something out in the open, we want to try and use existing tricks like cutting it along the clothing line. But when we have a cut that's going to go along a seam, right, we want to try hide it in the least obvious place that the player is going to, that the player won't see. So in my case, that would be probably underneath the arm here, right? Like the underside of the arm is somewhere that is rarely shown in video games. And I can see my object is a little bit wonky there in places. So I can try and adjust this cylinder, right, to try and make sure that I don't have any overlap. But it looks like I'm going to have to do some manual fixing. But what I do like about this so far is that this white line is all the way along the bottom, right? So once I have that cylinder in place, I can click away, and now I have this chunk, right, which is my arm. I can select it in the UV editor, and it will also select in the scene. Now I do need to worry about overlap here, right? I never want to have two faces overlapping, because that means when I draw my texture, right, on a flat section, right, anything that I draw on overlap will appear not only on this polygon, but on the polygon underneath it in the UVs. So it's not so bad when, say, you have two arms and you just overlay those arms, right? So that way when I draw the hand over here, it draws it in the correct place. But I don't want to have just random polygons sitting on top of one another. So what I like to do here is I will switch into either vertex or UV mode. Vertex will grab all of the polygons that are all the vertices that are attached, which is a little bit strange because, but when you think about it, right, say if I'm looking at this vert right here, 1, 2, 3, 4 faces are attached to this vertice, right? So when I move a vertice around, it's actually moving 4 different faces, which you can see in the checkerboard view, right? So this tiny little icon in the UV will let us see the checkerboard, which is going to help us smooth out the model. However, when I don't want to grab all 4 faces, I can switch from vertex mode over to UV mode, and that is going to treat that UV independently. So in this case, right, if I'm looking at where, which vert this is, right, it is connected to the hand here. However, it's not only connected to this arm, right, it is also connected over here to where the hand is unwrapped, right? If I select it there, same deal, it connects to this vert over here. That's why I like to swap into UV mode when I'm doing a single edit. I'm just going to move this back over to smooth it out. And same sort of here, when I see that like things are being bunched up and squished, right, I generally just try to even it out so that things are a little bit smoother. Now luckily Maya has introduced several tools that make this even easier, right? So once I have a chunk unwrapped, this is called a UV shell, right? I can select that shell by itself or any other shells that are connected, right? And again, anything that you select in the UV editor will be selected in the main scene view. I have a couple tools under here, right? Unfold, that I can use to soften the amount of stretching that's going on here. So to see the stretching, I can swap over into checkerboard mode. In this case, since this object is so large, the checkers are tiny and they're not really that helpful. So I'm just going to size it down, right? And I can move it over if I want. Typically when I'm working with a UV shell, I want it outside of my UV 1 or U1 V1, you know, the main cube where my texture is going to go. This is more like making a puzzle, right? I want to keep the pieces outside of the main puzzle before I'm ready to put them in. So I can use these tools under Unfold, and if I just click Unfold once, right, it does a really nice job of getting all of my checkerboard nice and smooth and the same size, right? So to go from something with this much stretching, right, Maya's algorithm does a really nice job doing an unfold. Now I can also use Optimize, which will do it in a bit of a slower fashion, right? It's more like a smudge where you're kind of like trying to fix specific areas. But that's going to be more for like if you're looking at the face, right, and maybe you have a small pinch on the nose, right, and you want to just soften that one little area. Unfold is more like I want to fix this whole piece all at the same time, right? So again, here's our seam at the bottom. Here you can see what's going to happen to the texture, right, is these pixels will be flowing that direction. The pixels that are painted on this other side will be flowing in another direction, and it will be visible to the player where that texture seam is. So we can look at a seam really quick. Alright, so we'll look at one of the Mixamo characters that I downloaded, this Archer character. And as you can see, it's got a really nice texture on it. right? Nice high-res texture. But there are still seams, right? You can't really get away from this. So here we can see one at the back of the boots. And if we look at this 3D model, we can see that there's a polygon split right there, right? An edge loop. So right between these polys, if we look in the UVs, we would expect to also see that to be the breaking point, right? And so this is what we see in the UV editor. This is the edge of the UV shell, and this is the other edge, right? They're coming together from different angles, therefore we can try to line them up, right? And they've done a pretty good job of lining things up. However, if you are hand painting textures, like it looks like this one was, generally it'll be quite hard to get rid of those seams unless you use certain tools that are made for the job, right? So we see it here at the back of the boots, here where the feet connect to the boots. Typically we'll also see it under the arm, just like on our character, right? And here through the shoulder where the arm has been connected. And again, it is worth looking at professional models just so that you can see the kinds of concessions that they make, right? Not everything is 100% perfect. It's just knowing how to hide things in a way that isn't going to be distracting to the player. So again, here we can see a seam between these two polys. If we look at that section on the unwrap, right, they are on opposite ends of this UV shell. Yeah. So from here, we just kind of continue across the model, right? We try and figure out what kinds of shapes are correspond possibly, you know, to cylindrical, planar, or spherical shapes. But we can also cut things directly, right? We can also like have things that are completely joined and then cut them manually. So maybe say if we want to look at the head, heads are sometimes tricky, and we're like, well, a head is a bit like a sphere, so we go for a sphere. That will pump out something like this, right, where everything is now connected to each other. But if we look on the UV unwrap, right, there's actually, let's resize it so our checkerboard is bigger, right? There's actually going to be a lot of stretching in certain areas, right? So with the head, typically, and it's already done this for us, but we'll redo it. With the head, typically your seam is going to be along the back here. So let's just go for something like a planar unwrap and give ourselves like a very basic starting point. So the issue with a planar unwrap, right, is that the sides are going to be very stretched, whichever direction is not facing towards the planar unwrap camera. So if we're going to fix this model, we would want to go into our cut tool, which is under cut and sew, and choose cut, and we want to be in edge mode. Oh, and now I accidentally hit cut with everything selected, and now it's cut all the faces apart. So let's so what that means, right, is since I hit cut with everything selected, now all of these faces are separate shells, right? So each of them can be moved apart without affecting any of the other, but that's not what we want. It's just a misclick. So if we select again, say we're going to do planar, move that object out of the way to its own little zone. Now we can look at where we would want to cut, right? So it's also going to depend on your game type, right? If you never see the character's face, maybe you don't mind having a seam down the middle of the face. However, that's risky because you might have like a cut scene and suddenly somebody else on your team wants to show the face, right? If we look at our archer character, right, this is a very typical way to unwrap a face. We want to have no seams visible all along the front of the face, right, so that all of that pore information, where typically as humans, right, we're going to look at the face first, all that information is going to be free from seams, and then you're going to try and hide the seam usually at the back of the head. So if we look at just the head here, maybe we can pull it out. This one. Oh, it does have a skin on it. I didn't like that. Can I hide the maybe? I guess here's our character, and there's the seam along the back of the head, right? Starting just at the hairline, right? Because we can hide that under hair, ending, you know, the back of the neck somewhere. What that allows us to do, right, is to have no seams across the face here. This is another common place to hide it, right, along the hairline, along the ear, and the jawline is sometimes another place where you can get away with it. That lets us have more texture information on the ear. Right, so here's a nice unwrapped face, and I think we looked at this briefly in even in our intro to 3D modeling last semester. So what we can do if we have a specific area that we know where we want the seam, right, and something like a head would be that, we can just go into select our shell, go into edge mode, I believe. We can just select those edges that we want to cut along, right? So that will split this UV shell right along those cuts, which then will unfold in a way that is more predictable, right? So right now our UV shell, all one object. If I grab any faces here, all these faces are attached to the one next to it, right? However, with a cut, that allows us to get rid of that issue, right? So again, if I'm in edge mode, I'll just select across the seam that I want to cut. In my case, it is along the center of the head here. Obviously, my head is very blocky. And then I can just click on cut, or I believe it is also in the UV menu here. Cut UV edges. So now what this means is that if I select a face that is next to this cut, right, and I move that, it is no longer affecting things on the other side of the cut. Yeah? Only the polys that are connected to it on this side. What that also allows me to do is when I use the unfold operation, now you are running a script, an algorithm, you know, math on these things when you click these buttons. So be sure to save. Save your scene before you try any of this stuff, right? Call it a new name. Make sure you've got a file there backed up so that you don't suddenly get a crash to desktop as soon as you hit something like unfold, right? Seems like a relatively simple operation, but the math of this, right, is it is taking now my head and is now like pulling all of that vertex data out of 3D space and mapping it onto 2D space. That requires every vertice being calculated, right? And that kind of math, right, that I believe is trigonometry, is not something that you can do in your head. So if I hit unfold, here we have retained the front of the face all in one piece, right? So let's get rid of checkerboard mode. Right, so the front of the face is all connected to itself, right? Whereas the seam runs down the back of the head. And you'll see that this shape, right, is quite similar to the shape that we would see on this model, right? Whereas it's become a flat surface, right? We can also use the optimize tool to try and soften this even more, right? If we notice like, oh, there's a bit of a jaggy on our checkerboard mode, right? We can just hit optimize a few times, and it will try to smooth out areas that where it's kind of done a quick pass on it, right? It's going to try and like make that a little bit better for view. And we can see now, using a cut and an optimize or an unfold, right, immediately gives us a very good result overall, right? If we're looking at checkerboard mode, it's almost like a preview of where the pixels are going to lie across the character. Obviously in clusters, right? It's probably 10 pixels per cube at least, or per square. So we can see where the seam is, right? Where this texture breaks. But we can also see the areas where we're not going to have any seam, right? Where we can feel free to paint across that that UV area, that shell, right, inside of Photoshop or something, and not feel like there's going to be any break in our artwork, right? Everything is going to be retained there. So now that I have two objects unwrapped, what I like to do is start to position them just in the square next to U1V1, right, and U2V1. You can really choose any of these squares. The other thing I need to start doing is to look at relative size, right? So if again we look at our Archer character from Mixamo, you'll notice that the head takes up almost a quarter of this character, right? And so anything that we're going to be looking at needs to have higher pixel density, right, on our model, which is going to help it look, you know, better than areas around it. Right now, it's not always that obvious, but you know, this face, if we, let's see if I can undo back, you know, being able to see all these little details on the face, like the eyebrows, on all these little freckles, right, that is going to help us feel like that is a high resolution, high poly model, right? Whereas if we zoom in some stuff like the fur, right, it's not going to look as good up close. We want to save as much of that pixel density information for the face, right, and maybe in this case on the hands, right, they've also used almost a quarter. And overall, you know, just on the skinned areas, almost half of their allocated texture space, right, just for those skinned areas, because you want to have those nice little details, right, which will make you feel like it is a high poly character. So the more important an object, the more pixels you want to include in that object, right? Like if it is, say if you're going to have like a mage carrying around a book, right, you're going to have to allocate enough space on your UV map for the text on that book to appear, right, without being a garbled mess, right? Otherwise, sometimes, you know, it's better to like pull that book texture off of the character and make it its own object, right, which will give you more space to work with and therefore greater pixel density. Okay, so from here, right, we can just continue across the model. Say if I want to start grabbing things that are symmetrical on the other side, typically I want to use the same sort of approach that I've used in on the other side, right? So one thing to consider is that you have a couple tools within the UV toolkit here that can be useful, including a set of transform tools where you can flip things and you can rotate them. So this is handy just for sometimes for like harder edge objects, right? If you have a crate or a bin or something, and you need something to line up exactly at 90 degrees, it can be really tough to do that with the rotate tool inside of the UV editor, and you end up having, well, you can zoom in almost infinitely with the UV editor, right? So trying to get, like, say, the center line exactly straight, right, might take you longer than it's worth. Whereas if you unwrapped it and it was already say you used a planar unwrap and it was already aligned to the world at 90 degrees, right? You would not need to mess with that. You could use this rotate option here to easily rotate things around, or you can flip them to be mirror images of themselves. So we'll look at how we might use the flip option here with the other arm, right? So if I select the other arm, now again, we have a couple options here, right? We could go to the UV cylindrical again, or we could decide to create our own seam, right? So say if we know where the seam is going to go now, we could try just grabbing a planar unwrap so that this is all one UV shell. Yeah, that lets us separate it and manipulate it. Then I can go to edge mode, select along the same seam that I used on the opposite side, right, under the arm, and then go to cut. Now when I select the UV shell and hit unfold, it'll give me pretty much the exact same shape as I have on the other side, right? Just at an angle. What I can do here is, if I do have symmetrical pieces, right, I can line them up, and in this case I guess I already flipped this one while nobody was looking. I can go inside of the transform, look under tools here, and say flip, right? And that will help me overlay two pieces that are the same, right? So what I used to do in these kinds of cases would be to select one side and do a copy, select the other side and do a paste. However, that seems to be a bit buggy, so I'm not sure what's going on there. So I've resorted to just aligning things up by eye, trying to make sure that all of these edges align pretty much to the pixel, right? So again, you can, if you're struggling to get something exact inside of the UV editor, right? Say if you have a small offset like this, the further you zoom in, the more precise your controls are going to be when you resize things. So that is sometimes necessary to just zoom in a little bit further, right, which lets you resize or to move things at a very like sub-pixel level, like very, very small. Right, so the reason why I might do two sections on top of each other, right, is only going to be when those sections are going to be exactly the same texture. This doesn't work super well if you have asymmetrical pieces on your character. Say, for example, a character I was making last semester, I did this part out of habit, and then as I was looking more carefully at his character art, I had a like an elbow piece of armor on the one side, but not on the other side, right? Just from the way that the character's stance is, it made sense for his fighting style. But then when I put the textures on both sides, you know, anything, if I cut anything there, or in this case it was when I did an ambient occlusion, right, because there was a covering over that elbow, right, it created a shadow there, which then was reflected on the opposite elbow, which I didn't need, right, so I had to go in and correct that by hand. But in general, right, if you have things like arms, legs, hands, right, that are going to be the same on both sides, you can sometimes get away with, and boots, right, can get away with making them identical on the, so let's see, and here you can see like they've done that on the boots, right? So on either boot, oops, look at the faces, it's not going to let me. So if I select some part of the boot here, right, anything over here, it's actually got a whole nother boot underneath it, right? Like that section, these guys have just been put on top of each other. So even though there are two of them, right, they are using the same texture space and they are identical, right? And just remember, right, to use the flip option inside of the UV tools to make sure that those look correct. And they're not doing this in all cases, right? Like on the legs, on the trousers here, there's a belt going across on one side, and so that in that region they were not able to mirror the trouser legs, right, because of that asymmetry. Alright, so moving across the character, again, we like to pick, go from easier pieces to harder pieces, right? So maybe the boots on my character would be my next stop here. If I went to face mode, selected a boot, and then I could choose to do a variety of automatic unwraps, right? I'll typically do that just so that there is some sort of stitching going on off the bat, right? I can also, remember, hit the little red T and change where the projection is coming from, right? The alignment of that projection, which will then change the object inside the UV flattened view. However, oftentimes, right, I just want to maybe create my own seam. So if I do want to create my own seam, right, and now like looked at the boot and been like, oh well, the player's probably never going to see the inside ankle, right? If they see the character from the side, they might see the outside ankle, but they'll probably never see this inside line here. So that might be a good place to hide a seam. Let's see how they tackled it over here on this boot, right? If we look at the seam cuts, they have a change in direction here, or an angle, right, which is going to be a good place for a seam. They went ahead and did it on the back of the boot, which is a perfectly valid place to put it as well. Yeah. So that sort of stuff is preference, right? If I just do, let's do a planar cut just so that everything is stitched together, right? And then I can switch into edge mode, maybe select some seams along here, and just to give it a little bit more breathing room, right, it probably can have a seam along the bottom of the foot as well. I don't know if I'll need that one. So I can do a cut, swap back, select my faces, and then use the unfold. Look at checkerboard mode, see how it looks, right? Obviously some weird stuff going on with this top of this foot here. But I also want to resize it right away just so that I can remember, you know, like its relative size to the rest of the objects that I need to unwrap. See if it's just a rotation issue, right? If I rotate to different angles. Typically I also orient things in the UV editor the same as I would want, you know, that my brain would want to see them. So the top of the head being at the top, right, and not being like, oh, I'm gonna paint the face at this like 45-degree angle and like have to draw, you know, with my head tilted. Same goes for things like boots, right? Like I want to make sure, like, okay, if this is a little front piece, is the toe, right? Like what's it connected to? If now I realize, oh, I don't even need this front piece connected to the bottom, right? Just go in here again, maybe I can make some more cuts. Oftentimes, for the bottoms of feet, you almost never see them. We might just cut those areas off completely, right? So we might just have those, make a cut there, and turn it into its own UV shell. That will allow us to do like a UV planar. In this case, it is completely the wrong angle. So I could just navigate, say, my camera to where I want it to be planar. I can go to UV camera based. So now I can see the bottom of the foot just here. Right, since it is never going to be seen, probably I can make it nice and small. And then I can get back to the boot and just tell it, okay, I've made a big change, so let's just unfold again and try to get a better result, right? In this case, it's done a nicer job. Where if I go to face mode, right now it's a little more clear to my brain that this is the top of the shoe, this is the nose of the shoe, right? And just to orient that again so that when I'm painting it, that my brain can wrap around that a little bit easier. Now, another option, if we're going to do a perfectly symmetrical character, right, which has a split down the middle, is to just unwrap half of the character, and we could even just delete geometry and then mirror the geometry after the fact, right? So if I really want to save myself some time, and I have a character that has the exact same geometry on both sides, what I might consider doing, this is a bit cheeky, is to just cut the character in half, right, which leaves me with half the amount of faces to unwrap, and then just anticipate having either, you know, sticking with the seam right down the center of the character, or to go back and stitch those after the fact, right? So I would have to come back and use the sew or the stitch tools in order to get those seams to disappear, right? So that those seams will be correctly stitched. But this might be a method that you want to use, right? Because now, if I were to take this object, right, and let's say, well, let me just do a like really quick so I can at least make some progress while I'm in here. That's my boot, right? Yeah. Let's grab a leg, do a UV cylindrical on the leg, do an unfold, right, to get it the right shape. Check the seam. The seam is currently sort of where I would want it, but actually, let's do the cylindrical again and just move by clicking the T. Grab it from a 90-degree angle, and then if we rotate, we can get the seam right down the inner thigh there, which is, again, the least likely place that a player will ever see it. Now that we have the cut, click Optimize. That gets my checkerboard looking good, right? If I resize, I can see my checkers now. As you get more and more pieces, right, the goal typically is to have all of the checkerboards across the different parts of the model relatively the same size. This would apply more to, you know, the arms and legs than it would to the face, just because the face, as we discussed, needs that higher density there. Now, I'm noticing that I do have a lot of history on this object, right? So I probably want to do a quick save. And if I'm happy with where I'm at, right, I can also do a delete all by type history. Maybe I should go to object mode. All right. Cool. So now we just have really the torso and the hands left. So let's just see what we can grab if we just do this, right? So here we can see everything that's left is still within the U1 V1. If I wanted to get rid of the hands, right, I might hold tab and paint this out. Okay, so now I just have the torso pieces. Again, probably a cylinder, right? It's going to be a pretty nice shape. Then I want to grab the T, click on the rotate so I can see where the seam is, right? And probably want to also have the seam along the underside of the arms here, right? Matching up with everything else on the side of the character. This left me with a bit of a weird result, probably because this gaping hole in the middle, right? And also because of this here, right, the crotch. So since that is still connected here at the bottom, I probably want to do a manual cut there by just selecting the center, add a cut. Then now I have the front and the back of the torso separate. Can do an unfold. See the checkerboard, right? Maybe I'll line these up and down. But now we can see the, oops, unfold first. Check the back. Move it over. So I haven't started to arrange yet. And then the last one being the hands. Let's just do a quick one here. Maybe spherical. Unfold. And the hands can be ugly. It's fine. I'm just gonna leave them there. Oh, what do we got down here? Who's hiding? Oh, that's at our bottom of the feet. Okay. So now the point for using a cut character, right, is now if I mirror this character, mirror character geometry, axis. Where is my axis? Object. It should be negative. Oh, there you go. So now, once I've mirrored my object, right, keep a very low merge threshold value here. But I do want to have merge border set. Ideally, this will be as close to 0 as possible. However, now, when I check my UVs, right, these should be in the exact same place on the UV editor, right? So now, instead of having to unwrap 2 arms, right, anything that I've done to 1 arm, right, it will be reflected over and the UVs will be perfectly in place there, yeah? And you can do this at a smaller scale, right, as well. You could do it just with the arms. You don't necessarily need to do it with the whole character. But that might be, you know, a shortcut for some of you. Now to fix the face, right, because we don't want the face to have a seam down the middle necessarily. Typically good habit. When we flip one of the sides, we can move it in close, you know, now kiss, like so. Then if we go to edge mode, right, and we select edges, we can see where the corresponding or the connected edge is on the model. And I like to use the stitch together tool here, which will actually move one of the shells in closer, right? So when we select some faces here and we say stitch together, now these faces are joined and there's no seam between them, right? And take it a step further by just doing another selection here, right? Maybe select the shell and just do an unfold or an optimize, right? You can always click optimize over and over again to try get a slightly smoother result. But just like this, we've gotten all the pieces on our character unwrapped, right? Again, if we're going to have, say, the back of the character shown and we want, maybe we want like a sword strap, you know, coming across the character. So we don't want a seam there to be reflected, right? We can do the same thing on other areas that we've reflected by just going to the flip option here. Move these over so that they are next to each other. Right, and then we can either do stitch together, right, which will try to move things in close, or if we have 2 edges that are a little more spread apart, right, we might use the sew option. you want to go one piece separate at a time. So here, from doing that, I would have created some stretching across the back of the character, or am I looking at the front here? Yeah, the back of the character. There might have been some stretching created when I did those sews. So again, I could just do an unfold or an optimize. Right? If I just do an unfold there and then line it up. Now I have no seam across the character, right? So I could do like a belt or a strap that goes at an angle across there and not necessarily have to worry about it. Looks like that one came out at a 90-degree angle. Again, so I want to use my in the UV toolkit rotate rather than just doing a manual rotate. I can check where those things correspond to. Oh, that's actually the bottom. Okay. So flip it back around. Now I can see I've got a seam still left here at the back of the neck if I wanted to fix. Just go to edge. Sew those together. So again, now I've got a few seams left, and I could do the same thing in the front, right? Like, let's just go ahead and do that. So flip, move things over. Then we could do a whole bunch of edges at the same time. All right, we could do a sew. Grab the faces, do an unfold, and then try to rotate it so that it is straight up and down. I believe there's also an alignment tool, but is it linear align? No, I won't mess with that. All right, so that gives me all of my shells, right? These are all the shells that I need. Now I want to start pulling them back into the U1 V1 space, right, which is over here. So that's where my texture is going to sit. Luckily, there is a tool that will bring all of these together and try to evenly distribute them. Right, this one will line them up in a line. The one that we're looking for is layout. So layout, under modify or control L, we'll try to use the checkerboards, right, to automatically, let's just go back so we can see what it does. Let's say we've got some pieces in here that are vastly different sizes, right? What layout should do is to put all of these things and calculate so that they have just as much room as they need, right? And make sure that they can all fit within the U1 V1 space. So I'm going to hit apply. This will be my result. But you'll notice that I believe that it will separate out anything that I've stacked previously, right? Now there are some options to stack in here. Again, I find that I would rather just kind of trust my eyeball and to rely on the algorithm all the time. But you might want to play with some of those other modified tools. Same thing with the leg, right? I had the legs aligned nicely previously. If I wanted to, say, use the layout, right, I could just select the islands that don't have symmetry and do a layout. That way it'll maximize the amount of space for all those objects. What you tend up having to do, right, is maybe resizing these down a little bit anyway, because we're going to want to allocate more room for the head, and then start to look, again, we have some objects in here that are duplicates or symmetrical. And so you can keep playing around with layout until you find something that's going to work for you. But the layout is really handy because it will try to match everything up to the same scale, right? As well as like fit it all in there. Yeah. So from here, it's just a matter of putting the symmetrical objects maybe on top of each other, and maybe getting less important objects like the feet, right, to be a bit smaller when they're not going to be noticed or not going to be visible, so we can give a little bit more room to the head, all the while avoiding any overlap, right? That's the last thing that we want. Alrighty, so with that pretty much taken care of, oh, we got some overlap on the foot here. Next thing we're going to want to do is take a UV snapshot that then we can put into Photoshop and start to paint on top of, right? One of the shortcomings of Maya and Photoshop is that there's sometimes a bit of a delay as you're painting, but we'll look at that really quick on how to get a texture started, right? We also don't want to have anything crossing this line right between the two UV spaces. Oh, what's this mess? Oh, this is my hand that I that I rushed through, right? Should have added more cuts to the hand, but for demonstration purposes, I think it's all right. So let's say this is my UV layout for my character. Let me go ahead and save and do my usual cleanup, right, to get rid of my history over here. Alrighty, so what I need to do is go inside of the UV editor to the image menu, choose UV snapshot, pick a size for my for the image that's going to be exported, right, and also a place for it in Windows. So this one is a bit buried, but that's all right. What I can do is I can select and copy this path here, hit apply, right? If I want to use a 1024, remember all textures should be perfect squares. If we look at professional textures as well, check the image size, everything is going to be in a multiple of 2. So 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, right? This is where we start getting into closer to game textures, 256 pixels, 512 by 512 pixels, 1024 by 1024, or 2K, which is 2048 by 2048. If you're into texturing, right, and generally as game designers, you want to have some of these pixel resolutions memorized to a degree. So 1024 is a good number, nice and default. We already have a file called OutUV, so I'll call it, what do I call my character? Main character. Hit apply. All right. So I can paste in that path minus the file name. Now I've got my main character. I can pull this into good old Photoshop, and it will give you something like this. So first thing I'll do is I'll just create a new layer and put it underneath so I can see that UV layout there. And obviously I don't want this super intense red. Go for neutral gray. Right. From here, I want to either work on this layer underneath or continue to make more layers. Say if I want to, create specific layers for certain things. The advantage of exporting as a PNG, right, is that it has made the UV layout. Oh, do I have? my arms aren't aligned there. I have to redo that, right? So if you noticed issues, might have to jump back in. And just clean up a little bit. To get things aligned a little bit better. Usually I prefer to give things a little bit of breathing room along the edges and between objects. Theoretically, it doesn't make a big difference, right? Where you shouldn't really have any overlap, but sometimes the colors will smudge right between two objects, especially when you start to make level of detail versions of that object, right? If I go from a 1024 texture down to like a 256 texture because that object is far away, suddenly it might not have enough pixel information, right, to notice these little gaps, and that can cause some smudging on top of your objects. So usually I tone it down a little bit, right? I would rather work with ever so slightly less room and make sure that I don't have any smudges than to risk smudges, right, from happening. So you won't always get your UVs right the first time. In fact, most times you'll have to come back into Maya and make some small adjustments like this, right? So don't sweat it. Just go back, do another UV snapshot. Call it main character 2. Hit apply, right, that new file. Just pop it back into Photoshop and maybe hide the first layer. Yep. So now I can start to think about painting, but I want to have my results show up on my model, right? So one thing to remember is when you are texturing a character or anything else and you've used the UV snapshot method, you want to hide your UV snapshot layer before you save your file, right? So I'm going to go in and save down my file and then apply it to my character. Alright, so I'm going to save as a PSD, and I'm just going to put it into a folder where I can find it. Then I'm going to save my character again. Commit and save. I'm going to open up the hypershade, and I'll create a new, say a Lambert texture is fine. If we're going to have specular on there, right, we would want to have a blend, which usually means that I'm going to choose a blend. Let's go ahead and make a blend actually, just so that we can make those additions later if we choose to. And I'll go to color, file, navigate to the folder where I saved my Photoshop document, hit open, select my character, drag, right click and drag on assign material to selection. Nothing will happen immediately. I have to hit 6 in the key inside the viewport in order to show that texture, right? So now I've got my texture showing. Again, what I don't want is have the cuts of my UV editor showing, right? If I save this, it's worth noting that things will not appear immediately. Typically, you have to open up the hypershade in order to get things showing. Let's see if it's going to cooperate. So let's just go ahead and paint in some of these other skin color areas. I guess I've got the hands right here. And this is our torso. It can be like shirt for now, maybe. I believe this is the back. If I'm ever confused on where an area relates to, I have to go back to the UV editor, face mode. So this is the front, this is the back. Okay, good to know. If that didn't suit me, right, I would have to go back into my UVs and move these around. Also, if I decided, right, that I would rather the legs attached to, you know, the waist down, I can make those cuts, right, and connect those to the legs. But for now, let's just go for a very, very quick and easy texture. Go with some jeans. Notice I'm working here on like a color layer by itself. We got the boots. And oh, this is the bottom of the boot. So I'll hide this layer. Here's my beautiful texture now. Updated here and updated on the model as well. So I guess maybe this is it's been upgraded a little bit. If you save the texture file as a PSD, right, while you're still working on it, it should be relatively quick to update. Let's see how quick it is. You can also, I believe we looked at last semester, you can also have it update in real time by using the, what we did was we used the Photoshop 3D toolset, which kind of buggy, not my favorite. So let's see how it stacks up in terms of the update speed. We go along, we'll do some coloring down here, and hit Control S. Okay, no update yet. If I open Hypershade, it should update that file as soon as I have opened Hypershade. So plan on using that little workaround or that little bug fix, right? Here you can see again, you know, where the seams are, even in a very low res texture, right? You're gonna notice it. But the other thing we could do potentially is to go into UVs, right, and tweak those UVs ever so slightly, right, using the UVs option here, and maybe grabbing these little areas where we can see there's an issue. Is it not that one on the edge? Oh, it's further up, it's on this torso piece. So like here, for instance, right, if we start to move these UVs around on one side or the other, you can nudge them into place so that there's less stretching, right? It is worth doing another UV snapshot, right, if you do end up changing the UVs like this in any way. But it's just worth noting that, you know, you can start to adjust and compensate for any weird seam areas, right, like here, either by nudging around the UVs, right, the parts themselves, but you also want to consider just painting in different areas, right? So I don't really need you guys to go much further than this for your character texture, right? If you get flat colors on there, everything else is pretty much gravy, you know, like it's all extras from there. If you want to keep your character very simple like this, right, especially like we looked at, if you're going to be seeing your character from far away, it's not a big deal if you stay with very low amount of detail, right? You don't necessarily have to get in here and paint all the fingers on, or to paint a face on. But you've got it, right? It's in Photoshop. You guys kind of know how to use Photoshop, right? So not as stressful as all that once you get started, right? But I'm not really going to be counting stuff against you, right? What I do recommend is that you experiment now at this stage, right, with all these character texture things, because we're going to be doing it pretty hardcore next semester in organic modeling, right? We'll make quite a few characters, I think, for practice, and each one that we make will be better and better, right? So if you start that process now, you start getting more used to the UV tools, working with organic shapes that, you know, have to be flattened from every single angle, seeing how drawing on the texture appears on the actual model itself, right? Like my perfectly round little eyeballs here became stretched, right? Figuring out like, oh, I can actually tweak things, right? I can move things around to soften that effect, right? To get things to be more like I want them to appear, right? All of that learning is gonna pay off in spades next semester, right? Where if we don't test this stuff now, it's going to be quite stressful. So we have my beautiful, beautiful, beautiful character, nicely unwrapped. One other thing to touch on, it is in low poly style, right? If I wanted to smooth them out a little bit, I could also do a soften edges, right? And he is good to go, right? I can take this and put it into Unity, right? Export it as an FBX. I can also take him directly into Mixamo, right? Upload him to Mixamo, create a quick rig, and attach Mixamo animations to him, just like that, really quick. So spend a little bit of time on your character, right? Give him some love. Add more cuts and things if you want to give yourself a bit of a challenge, right? What I'm going to do next is I will work on my higher poly character, right? So that we can look at taking something with more detail into Substance Painter. I added a little gargoyle pet. So that we can use PBR materials, right? Physically based rendering materials to get really, really nice textures. But for purposes of 3D level design, perfectly happy if you guys come up with something like this. I will be very impressed, especially obviously you non-artists who are going to find this challenging. For you artists, right? Put in some extra time, maybe make a few characters. Like enemy character, make your least important character first, make your most important character last, right? That way everything that you learn along the way will be demonstrated when you reach that final stage. So thanks for watching, guys, and let me know if you have any questions or issues with this, and I will upload a part 2 on the higher poly character and taking this apart into UVs, which same process, just more to deal with, lots more, right? If we look at his automatic unwrap, right, we just got a lot more puzzle pieces. Works the same as a puzzle, you go from a 100 piece puzzle and then you get used to it, you go on, keep using puzzles until you're at 1,000 pieces, and then when you're a superstar, you can you can go up to the super difficult puzzles of like 5,000 pieces, you know. So the more polys you end up putting on your character, right, the more work you're making for yourself in the UV stage. That's why I do recommend you guys stick with, you know, very low poly characters to start with, and then slowly work your way up to the more difficult ones. And that way, you know, once all this stuff sort of makes sense and the tools and the process make sense, then we can approach it from the opposite direction, which is high poly model first, low poly model, and then finding textures in the middle there. So thanks again, guys. I will talk to you soon, hopefully.